I still remember the sound. The sharp, rapid beep of the cockpit alarm slicing through the heavy silence, each pulse driving deeper into my skull. My jet, the Gulfstream G650 I'd entrusted with my company's future, had gone silent. Dead, stuck on the runway, in the middle of a forgotten airstrip somewhere in the Nevada desert. Just moments ago, I'd been on the verge of closing a monumental deal that could catapult my satellite network into global dominance. Now, my life's work was teetering on the edge of collapse. Desperate to reach anyone who could save me from this spiraling disaster, I could feel Omnicorp's board breathing down my neck, their patience disintegrating by the second. Arthur Jenkins, Dr. Olivia Reed, Ben Carter, they were waiting for me in Houston, their faith in me thinning like the desert air. If I missed this window, if I failed to be there, they would walk away. Billions would vanish. I would vanish. The engineers, led by Frank Miller and Jake Peterson, had been at it for 12 hours, maybe more. Sweat clung to their brows as they moved in frustrated circles around the jet. Each restart attempt was a cruel joke. The engines would hum, the system would flicker, and then, nothing. Just the merciless blink of system failure. "It's the auxiliary thrust control," Frank muttered, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. They were grasping at shadows. And then, as if conjured by the desert wind, she appeared. I caught the faint shuffle of footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw a little girl, no more than 9, walking toward the jet. Her gaze locked onto it with a strange intensity. Beside her, an elderly woman followed, her silver hair shimmering under the sun. Brenda, the flight coordinator, whispered her name to me as if afraid to disturb the air around us. Skylar Evans. "She's Eleanor Vance's granddaughter." The girl clutched a battered military ID tag, her fingers tracing the edges as if it were a secret key. Without asking, she climbed the metal steps and approached the malfunctioning jet like it was a puzzle waiting for her hands. The silence among the engineers was palpable, half in annoyance, half in disbelief. Who lets a child on a runway during a crisis? But Skylar was unmoved by our skepticism. Her eyes danced over the panels, her small hands brushing over the rivets, the seals, the valves. And then she spoke, her voice steady, almost clinical. "It's the servo pressure regulator valve." I wanted to dismiss her. God, I wanted to. But something in her conviction made me pause. Against my better judgment, I ordered them to check it. "Just look," I said, almost embarrassed by my own words. It took them less than 15 minutes to verify. And when Frank looked up from the diagnostics, his face was pale, his hands trembling. "She's right," he whispered. "Exactly right." But that didn't save us. The part Skylar identified wasn't something we could simply swap out. It was custom-made, with weeks of lead time. The desert sun burned hotter, as if pressing us toward the inevitable. I could feel the deal slipping through my fingers, could hear Omnicorp's private jets already warming up to leave me behind. "We'll need some industrial-grade polymers, but it can work." It was madness. Even if we could print it, the margin of error was microscopic. A failure mid-flight would mean total destruction. I hesitated, drowning in the calculus of risk. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice trembling with memory. She told me about Skylar's father, Captain David Evans, a military aerospace engineer who had died 8 years ago, protecting sensitive technology in a war zone. I froze. The name. The story. It cracked open a vault I had buried long ago. David Evans had saved my life. Not once, but twice. Once, when he pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Kabul. I had carried the weight of that debt in silence. And now, here was his daughter, offering me a lifeline I didn't dare trust, but one I couldn't walk away from. I looked at Skylar, and, for the first time that day, I allowed myself to believe. "We do this," I said quietly. "Together." In that moment, I wasn't just betting on her. The atmosphere shifted, not in our favor. The Omnicorp partners, who had been anxiously pacing back and forth, now regarded me with something worse than frustration, disdain. As if I'd forfeited my credibility the moment I put my faith in Skylar. During our tense conference call that followed, they openly questioned my sanity. "Is this the kind of leadership we're supposed to trust?" Olivia said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Billions of dollars balanced on a prototype made by a little girl." Ben didn't speak, but the way he closed his tablet with a decisive snap told me all I needed to know. He was out. He would take his shares, his satellites, his support, and walk. I should have been used to this by now, being isolated, being doubted. I'd clawed my way up from nothing, through the unrelenting noise of people telling me I wasn't enough. But somehow, their disbelief still lodged itself deep inside me like splinters I couldn't remove. It wasn't just them. Even Frank, even Jake, they humored Skylar's plan only because I ordered them to. But I could see it in their eyes. They were humoring me, a man on the edge, desperate enough to follow the wild theory of a child because he had run out of options. Every word I spoke landed on their ears like static. My authority, once absolute, now barely filled the room. The worst betrayal, though, wasn't from them. It was from Sophia Chun, my own executive assistant, the person who had stayed by my side through the most volatile years of my career. I overheard her whispering to Brenda Davies, not knowing I was nearby. "He's losing it," she said, the weight of her words crushing me from within. "Putting the company in the hands of some desert girl? He's going to destroy everything." I wanted to confront her, to ask her how quickly her faith in me had evaporated. But all I could do was walk away, the bitter taste of abandonment pressing hard against my tongue. You expect betrayal from competitors. It's demolition. I stood by the hangar's open bay, my hands buried in my pockets, watching Skylar work with Frank and Jake as if she had always belonged there. She sketched on a tablet with a quiet focus, her small brow furrowed as she explained stress tolerances and torque calculations that no 9-year-old should understand. And maybe, just maybe, they were rejecting it because they couldn't accept that salvation might come from someone like her. Like me. I had been there once, standing at the edges. I turned away from the runway and made my way to the portable operations unit where Arthur, Olivia, and Ben were waiting. Before they could launch another protest, I cut them off. "You're free to go," I told them, my voice steadier than I expected. "If this fails, it's on me, not on OmniCorp. I release you from any liability." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "And your stake?" His silence louder than any insult he could have thrown. I looked back at the jet, at Skylar adjusting the 3D printer settings with a precision that should have been impossible. I had no safety net now, no backup plan, no approval from my peers. But I had something else, a decision I couldn't unmake. I walked back to her, the desert wind tugging at my sleeves. But it cracked open a chamber inside me I hadn't dared touch in years. "Just don't leave." I crouched beside her, the hum of the printer filling the silence between us. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered. And for the first time in a very long time, I meant it. Even though I had made my choice, the weight of fear pressed against my ribs like a tightening vice. I wasn't afraid of losing the deal anymore. I wasn't even afraid of losing the company. What clawed at me was the gnawing terror that I had pinned everything, my legacy. I saw Captain David Evans pulling me from the wreckage in Kabul, the searing heat of flames licking at our boots as bullets tore the air around us. His voice, calm but urgent, had been the only thing tethering me to life. I remembered the emails he sent months later, warning me of an impending cyber attack I was too blind to see, right before he vanished on a mission he would never return from. David Evans had saved me twice, and now I was standing on the edge of a decision that could dishonor everything he had sacrificed. The fear pulsed louder. What if Skylar was wrong? What if I had dragged her into this storm only to break her under the weight of my desperation? My hands trembled as I pressed my palms against the cool metal frame of the jet. I squeezed my eyes shut, the humid taste of panic thick on my tongue. I was terrified of losing, of trusting, of believing in something I couldn't control. And that's when they called my name. Not in private, not in hushed, respectful tones, but over the loudspeakers. A voice from OmniCorp's security team cut through the air. "Marcus Thorne, please report to the Central Operations 10 immediately." It wasn't a request. It was an order. As I walked toward the tent, heads turned. Engineers paused mid-task. Technicians exchanged glances, their skepticism a tangible weight. Assembling every failed project, every miscalculation, every buried scandal they could find. They had built a dossier against me. "Before you go any further," Arthur began, her gaze steely, "you're gambling with more than your fortune, Marcus. You're gambling with lives." Ben laid the file on the table, tapping the stack with calculated precision. "You've been reckless before. People have covered for you. They won't this time." They were telling me to abandon Skylar, to protect myself, to retreat to the safety of predictable failure instead of risking unpredictable salvation. I looked at the file, my sins neatly cataloged, my past failures sharpened into weapons. And I felt something unexpected rise inside me. Not fear, not surrender. A flicker, a glimmer, of worth. I wasn't the reckless boy from those files. I wasn't the man who took shortcuts because he was afraid of losing his place at the table. I was the man David Evans had saved. And maybe, just maybe, I could be someone his daughter could trust. I pushed the file aside. "You think you've cornered me," I said quietly. "You think you're giving me a way out." I looked each of them in the eye. "I'm not taking it." Arthur's mouth tightened into a grim line. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said, my voice steady, "but I'd regret it more if I walked away from her now." I turned on my heel and left them there, their silence pressing against my back. I stepped into the desert air, the warmth settling against my skin like a second heartbeat. Skylar was still working, her small fingers adjusting the calibration with a surgeon's precision. Frank and Jake hovered nearby, their skepticism slowly giving way to reluctant focus. I sat down on the concrete beside her, close enough for her to hear me, but not so close as to disrupt her concentration. "You know," I said, watching the 3D printer layer each delicate strand, "they're all waiting for me to fail." She didn't look up. "Let them wait." I smiled, the weight on my chest easing just slightly. The first time in years I felt like I wanted to keep fighting, not for my empire. Not for my pride, but for this moment. For her. For the version of me I'd almost forgotten could exist. Skylar glanced at me, her eyes sharp and calm. "We can do this," she said simply. Like it was the most obvious truth in the world. And I realized then, I wasn't afraid anymore. Even as we pressed forward, something gnawed at me. The failure of the auxiliary thrust system, it had come from nowhere. The diagnostics hadn't detected any prior degradation. The blockage had developed too quickly, too precisely. It didn't make sense. And the more I thought about it, the more it refused to sit quietly in the back of my mind. I had spent my life unraveling problems that others deemed unsolvable. And now, I began to dig. While Skylar oversaw the printer's final passes, I slipped into the operations tent and pulled up the aircraft's recent maintenance logs. Nothing unusual on the surface. But there was a name, an external contractor who wasn't part of my usual rotation. He had signed off on the last inspection just days before the failure. I called Brenda over, my voice low. "Have you seen this technician before?" She squinted at the screen. "No, that's not our usual guy." A tremor of unease passed through me. I dug deeper, cross-referencing flight logs, service records, supplier chains. And then I found it, a missing shipment, a rerouted parts order process through an unsecured server. It shouldn't have happened. Our protocols were airtight, unless someone bypassed them. I needed confirmation. I called Sophia, despite the bitterness still clinging to her last words. "I need you to verify the access logs for the Gulf Stream." Her voice clipped, but not as cold as before. "I need you," I admitted. Simple, honest. A sigh, then, "I'm on it." When she called back, her voice was strained. The contractor's ID was flagged in an internal security bulletin last month. Possible ties to corporate espionage. "Marcus, this wasn't an accident." I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, my pulse drumming like a war march in my ears. Someone had sabotaged the jet, and if Skylar hadn't been there, I would have never found it. This wasn't just about saving a plane. Someone was trying to destroy me. But who? And why now? The timing wasn't random. It aligned perfectly with the Omnicorp deal. The dots connected themselves in rapid, merciless succession. If I failed to reach Houston, the contract would collapse, the satellite project would die, and the competitive advantage I'd spent years building would dissolve overnight. This was no coincidence. Guiding it through its final sequence. I couldn't walk away from this. I wouldn't. I typed a formal request to Omnicorp's cybersecurity team, flagging the incident as potential sabotage. She said softly, but her eyes burned with certainty. Frank and Jake moved swiftly, following her instructions as she guided the installation. Their doubt hadn't disappeared, but it had quieted, replaced by the singular focus of people who understood that hesitation now meant failure. As they worked, I gathered everyone, Brenda, Sophia, even the skeptical ground crew, and told them what I discovered, that this wasn't just a mechanical failure, that someone had set us up to fail. Their faces hardened. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer just a race against time. It was a fight against someone hiding in the shadows. I looked at Skylar, this impossibly brilliant girl who had walked into my life when I needed her most. "We finished this," I said. "We don't let them win." She didn't hesitate. "Let's get you to Houston." It wasn't just about the deal anymore. It was about standing against whoever thought they could tear me down. It was about proving that the smallest voices, the ones people dismiss, are sometimes the ones that save us. I wasn't going to walk away from that. Not now. Not ever. The jet's auxiliary thrust system clicked into place as Frank and Jake finished securing the temporary valve. The desert air hung thick, tense, as if even the wind was holding its breath. We didn't have time for simulations, no room for second guesses. This was it. We would either soar or shatter. I climbed into the cockpit. The leather seat familiar yet now foreign under the weight of what we were about to attempt. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the ignition. Skylar sat beside me, unusually calm. Her eyes sharp and watchful, reading the instrument panels like sacred texts. "Ready?" I asked, though I already knew her answer. She nodded once. "Start auxiliary systems first, then main engines." Her voice anchored me. I followed her sequence precisely. The auxiliary system roared to life, a deep hum vibrating through the fuselage. For the first time in hours, the warning lights stayed dark. No flicker. No failure. I moved to the main engines. The Gulfstream shuddered, then stabilized. The turbines spinning up into a smooth crescendo that sent an electric pulse through my chest. It worked. The impossible worked. A flicker of laughter broke from Frank's radio channel. "It's alive." She did it. But victory was not without consequence. Sophia's voice crackled through the intercom. "Marcus, you need to know. Someone's trying to scrub the maintenance logs. They're covering their tracks in real time." "They're still in the system?" I shot back, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Yes, and I think they're watching us." It was no longer just an internal threat. Someone out there knew we had survived the sabotage, and they were moving quickly to erase every trace of their involvement. I needed to get to Houston now. The deal wasn't just about the satellites anymore. It was the only way to force this into the light, to confront whoever was orchestrating this from behind the veil. I shoved the throttle forward, the jet lunging down the runway as dust and pebbles scattered beneath us. As we lifted into the sky, Skylar's grip tightened on the edge of her seat. But she didn't flinch. The climb was smooth, the controls sharp and responsive, more so than before. Her calculations were perfect, but the skies didn't bring relief. Halfway to Houston. "Who?" Silence. Then, softly, "Ben Carter." It landed like a stone in my chest. One of the men I had trusted, who had stood with me for years. His impatience at the runway. His eagerness to walk away. It wasn't frustration. It was calculation. He needed me to fail, and he had nearly succeeded. I felt the betrayal burn, familiar and yet always fresh. I gripped the yoke tighter, the muscles in my jaw aching. Skylar watched me carefully. "You don't have to go alone," she said quietly. There was no bravado in her words, just a simple truth. I wasn't alone. When we landed in Houston, I didn't go straight to the Omnicorp meeting room. I went to the security office first, where I demanded to see all the flight logs, all the personnel records. I pulled Sophia in via video call, her steady voice guiding the security team as we built the case, names, times, digital footprints. Frank and Jake joined me. I could have sent the evidence anonymously. I could have leaked it quietly and vanished, but something in me refused to hide anymore. The same caution in their eyes as the day I left them at the desert airstrip. Before we discussed the launch schedule, I began, tossing the data tablet onto the table. "I think you should see this." Just days after the deal was finalized, the media storm ignited. A leaked report, details I hadn't released, found its way into the hands of reporters. Headlines blazed across every screen. I thought I would suffocate under the glare. People dissected the footage of our emergency landing, screenshots of Skylar beside me in the cockpit flashing like wildfire. Commentators questioned my judgment. Analysts speculated whether I had completely lost touch with reality. The story was too unbelievable to be ignored, a billionaire entrusting his empire to a 9-year-old girl. Omnicorp scrambled to control the narrative. They tried to paint me as an unhinged maverick clinging to desperate measures. Ben's allies seeded quiet doubts, suggesting I had staged the failure to manipulate public sympathy. For a moment, the weight of the story threatened to collapse on top of me. But then something changed. At a crowded press conference in Houston, my first public appearance since the incident, I stood behind the podium, Skylar's small hand resting at my side. Camera shutters clicked like hailstones. I had expected the barrage of accusations, the disbelief, the ridicule. Instead, I found something else. When I looked up, I saw people leaning in, listening, curious, not just about the scandal, about her. I told them the truth. I told them about the malfunction, about the impossible diagnosis, about Skylar's solution, about the risk we took. I told them how she saved not just the jet, but the entire mission. And then, without hesitation, I introduced her. Skylar stepped forward, her voice steady despite the sea of strangers. She explained her process, her reasoning, her calculations, with a clarity that stunned the room into silence. There was no arrogance in her tone, just quiet precision. A child who knew what she was talking about. I watched the walls of skepticism crumble in real time. Even the most hardened journalists began to soften. A slow ripple passed through the audience. Omnicorp's internal investigation had confirmed everything. The falsified maintenance records, the unauthorized contractor, the digital footprints that led back to him. His sabotage was now public knowledge. I dropped the final blow. We trusted the wrong people, I said, my gaze locking on to him from across the room. And sometimes the smallest voices, those we dismiss, are the ones that save us. His jaw tightened, but he couldn't speak. Not here. Not now. The cameras devoured his silence. The press conference wasn't just a defense, it became a reckoning. The video clips surged across social media platforms within hours. YouTube commentators, tech analysts, even philosophy vloggers dissected every second of Skylar's explanation. People weren't just interested in the technical marvel. We had cracked something deeper. We had pierced through a cynicism that had hardened around the industry. They called her the runway prodigy. They called me reckless, then brave, then something else entirely human. Sophia forwarded me messages that poured into our inbox. Parents, teachers, engineers, people from around the world writing to say they saw their own children, their own hidden potential, reflected in Skylar's story. But it wasn't about viral headlines anymore. It was about what we could do with this. The board approved my proposal to launch the Soaring Dreams Foundation, a commitment to create pathways for gifted children who otherwise would never be noticed, never be trusted with the kinds of problems that adults so fiercely guard. I announced the foundation publicly, with Skylar and her grandmother Eleanor standing proudly at my side. A brilliant one, yes, but a child nonetheless. You can give her opportunities, Marcus. You can even let her guide the foundation. But you must protect her childhood. Her words struck me in a place I hadn't known was still tender. All my life, I had raced forward, always the next summit, the next war, the next win. Eleanor's condition was simple. Skylar would remain involved, but she would have space to grow, to play, to stumble outside the suffocating pressure of global expectations. I promised her I would honor that. And when Skylar later asked me if I thought she was ready for everything that was coming, I gave her the most honest answer I could. No, I said, smiling. But neither was I. We stood there. We had already won. I thought the press conference would bring closure. I thought the truth would taste like relief. But that night, in the quiet of my hotel room, with the city lights blinking faintly beyond the window, something inside me began to unravel. I had won. I had exposed Ben. I had saved the deal. I had launched the foundation. I thought back to every boardroom, every confrontation, every sleepless night clawing for relevance, for success, for validation. And the question struck me harder than any accusation ever could. Was I ever really doing this for them? Or was I always just doing it for me? I told myself I had built the company to change the world. I told myself the satellites would connect people. The technology would advance humanity. But deep down, hadn't I been chasing something else? A hunger to prove I belonged. That I was not the kid from nowhere. The outsider who didn't deserve his seat at the table. The weight of that realization pressed into my chest, suffocating. I had spent years moving from victory to victory, thinking I was building something unbreakable, yet everything I'd constructed now felt fragile, as if one hard truth could collapse it all. I thought of Skylar, of her certainty, her calm defiance. The gnawing doubt burrowed deeper. Maybe I wasn't a hero in this story. Maybe I never had been. I tried to shake it off, but the questions followed me into my dreams. In the dark, I relived that moment in Kabul, the explosion, the searing heat, the suffocating smoke. But this time, David didn't reach me in time. I saw myself crushed under the flaming wreckage, gripping the porcelain as I stared into the mirror. Who was I, really? The man who had survived? Or the man who should have stayed buried? And then came the worst thought. At breakfast, Skylar approached me, sliding into the booth with her usual quiet confidence. She picked at her toast, her small brow furrowed in thought. Without looking at me, she asked. And I realized maybe she carried the same weight I did. The same ache to prove herself. The same silent war against invisibility. I feel that way more often than I want to admit, I said. My voice barely above a whisper. She finally looked up at me. But you keep going. Sometimes, I confessed, I don't know why. She smiled, a small, knowing thing, and simply said, maybe you don't need to know. Maybe you just need to keep walking. It was such a simple answer, but somehow it anchored me. I wouldn't outrun my doubt in a single night. I wouldn't erase the shadows with one grand victory, but I could choose to keep walking. Not for the boardrooms, not for the headlines, not even for the ghosts of the past, but for her. Others hailed me as a visionary who had finally shattered the gatekeepers of traditional engineering. But the loudest noise came from those who weren't in the room. Those who hadn't seen the desperation on that runway. Those who didn't understand what it meant to trust the impossible. I became a symbol, and not always the one I wanted to be. One moment I was praised as the tech mogul who broke the mold. The next I was vilified as the reckless billionaire who risked a child's life for his own gain. Even as the Soaring Dreams Foundation gained momentum, the narrative fractured. Headlines clashed. Talk show hosts debated me like I was a faceless abstraction. Was I an innovator or a manipulator? A savior or a gambler? The internet loves a spectacle, but it loves to tear it down even more. And then the lawsuits came. Ben Carter's legal team wasn't content to vanish in disgrace. They filed multiple claims against me: defamation, breach of contract, even child endangerment. It was a calculated assault, designed not to win, but to grind me down. Omnicorp's board distanced themselves carefully, issuing cold, measured statements that supported the foundation in principle but remained neutral regarding the ongoing legal inquiries. The most vicious attack came from a coordinated media campaign that painted me as unstable, irresponsible, a man spiraling out of control. They unearthed my past, every failed prototype, every shelved project, every burned-out partnership. They painted me as a man who clung to a child's genius because he had nothing left of his own. I remember sitting in my office, the blinds half drawn, as I scrolled through the headlines, each one slicing deeper. Marcus Thorne, visionary or villain? Child prodigy or corporate pawn? Inside the mind of a fallen titan. The public unmaking of everything I thought I had built. Sophia tried to steady me, but I could hear the fatigue in her voice. Frank and Jake stood by me, but they couldn't shield me from the tide. Even Skylar, with all her resilience, began to sense the weight pressing in. She asked me one night, in a voice too small for her age, did I do something wrong? I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her this wasn't her burden. But the truth is, we were already bound to each other by the choice we made on that runway. And in the court of public opinion, she was as exposed as I was. The silence from Omnicorp's leadership was louder than any verdict. When I reached out to Arthur Jenkins, his carefully chosen words chilled me. We can't afford to be tied to a liability right now. I knew what he meant. They would protect the deal, but not me. Ben's allies had succeeded in isolating me. I thought I had weathered worse storms. But this time, the walls of the fortress I had built around myself began to crack. I questioned whether I could keep the foundation alive, whether I could keep Skylar out of the crossfire. There were moments I considered walking away, letting it all collapse. I could disappear, sell the company, leave the public eye, start over somewhere no one knew my name. But each time I veered toward that thought, I would see her face. The way Skylar's eyes lit up when she solved a problem. I had promised myself to protect what she represented, the part of me that still believed in something. So I stayed. I chose to stay. I chose to fight, even if the world didn't want me to. Even if it meant I might lose. Even if it meant they would never see me as the hero. Because maybe being the hero wasn't the point. Maybe standing beside someone who still dared to believe, that was enough. And maybe, for the first time, that was all I ever really needed. When everything seemed to narrow into isolation. When the noise of accusations felt suffocating, an unexpected voice broke through the static. It was Brenda. She called one evening, her tone steady, her words simple. I believe you. I always did. At the brink of collapse, and while others had retreated, she stepped forward. She didn't offer grand strategies or empty reassurances. Instead, she sent me a list: technicians, mechanics, independent security analysts, all people who had quietly come to the same conclusion I had. The sabotage wasn't isolated. The threat wasn't over. It wasn't just Ben. It was a network. Not the only one left standing in the debris of orchestrated collapse. Skylar sat beside me as I pieced their stories together. Her small hands traced the maps and schematics we gathered. Her eyes sharp with curiosity. "This isn't just about us, is it?" she asked quietly. "No," I admitted. "It's bigger. Much bigger." Frank and Jake returned to my side without hesitation. They had witnessed Skylar's brilliance firsthand. They had crossed the threshold from doubt to belief, and they weren't turning back. Together, we formed something new, a circle not bound by contracts or headlines, but by the stubborn resolve to uncover the truth. We set up late-night meetings in rented warehouses, gathered fragments of data from technicians in distant states, followed trails buried beneath corporate layers. Brenda worked the communications, Sophia coordinated the logistics, and Frank pored over maintenance codes I had once dismissed as irrelevant. Skylar was no longer simply a bystander. She guided us. Her mind danced through complex technical gaps that seasoned engineers had missed. She found discrepancies in server records, traced unauthorized data packets, and quietly built a case none of us could refute. And then, something remarkable happened. People started to listen. Quietly at first, emails, encrypted messages, hushed phone calls from insiders who had read the story, who had seen the press conference and dared to hope there might be a way to fight back. Their stories flooded in. Cases of small but intentional equipment failures, hidden breaches in cybersecurity systems, silent sabotage buried in the routine of maintenance checklists. It became clear we weren't dealing with a single betrayal. We were facing a pattern. A network of calculated disruptions designed to collapse key infrastructures while profiting in the aftermath. As our findings deepened, our movement grew. It spread across forums, YouTube channels, anonymous blogs. Not the polished news outlets, not the mainstream networks, but the places where people went to search for the stories no one else was telling. Our quiet investigation ignited something I hadn't expected. Other engineers stepped forward. Pilots, technicians, cybersecurity specialists, each with fragments of a larger picture. Some were people who had once distrusted me. Some were strangers who had simply seen enough. We created a digital haven, a space where these fragmented stories converged. Frank called it the hangar, a private network where we could safely exchange information, where those once silenced could finally speak, teaching them how to spot anomalies in systems that adults had long overlooked. She wasn't just saving us now. She was shaping something that would outlive us all. One evening, after a long day of piecing the threads together, I asked her, "Why do you keep showing up? After everything, why not just step away?" She shrugged, her gaze distant but sure. It was about refusing to let silence win. And for the first time since this war began, I realized I wasn't leading the charge. I was following her, the girl who had once wandered onto my runway. Uninvited, unassuming, had now become the quiet compass guiding dozens of others who had finally found the courage to raise their voices. We weren't a company anymore. We were a movement. And our story, her story, was only just beginning. Just when I thought we had regained our footing, the ground shifted again. Ben Carter wasn't finished. His return came like a storm front. Sudden and calculated. He reemerged through proxies, cloaked in new alliances, using media platforms and corporate partners I hadn't even realized were in his pocket. His tactic was brutal. He didn't attack the present. He attacked my past. They dredged up every project I'd ever abandoned, every flawed prototype, every miscalculation that had cost investors money or trust. They spun those failures into a narrative that painted me as consistently reckless, a man who always danced on the edge of disaster and just happened to pull off a miracle once. He orchestrated interviews with former colleagues who painted me as erratic. They clipped my old speeches out of context, pairing them with slick commentary that cast doubt on my stability. But the most vicious blow came when they targeted my earliest loss, the drone prototype that had malfunctioned years ago during a flight demonstration in Texas. How long before someone gets hurt again? Even the hangar came under fire. Anonymous users spread disinformation, suggesting we were manipulating stories, recruiting children to advance a personal agenda. They planted seeds of doubt in the very network we had carefully built. I saw the hesitation creep into the eyes of those who had once rallied behind us. Skylar noticed too. She sat across from me in our dimly lit workspace. This fierce child who had carried us further than I ever could alone. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She didn't blink. Finish it. We faced them. We arranged a final confrontation, a public forum, streamed live, no rehearsals, no protective filters. Ben agreed to appear. He couldn't resist the spectacle. He believed I was too weakened to challenge him now, too discredited to stand against his carefully crafted narrative. The day of the forum arrived. The auditorium buzzed with press, engineers, critics, supporters, and those who simply came to watch me fall. As I stepped onto the stage, I felt strangely calm. This wasn't about clearing my name anymore. It wasn't about redemption. It was about the truth. About standing there for the people who still believed, even when it wasn't easy. Ben wasted no time, laying out his accusations, parading figures, failures, and fears. "You've always been this man," he sneered. "A man who pushes too far, risks too much, and expects the world to call him a hero when he stumbles into success." I didn't argue. I didn't defend. Instead, I turned to the audience, to the cameras that beamed our words into thousands of homes. "Yes," I said plainly. "I failed. I've made mistakes. But you know what I didn't do? I didn't walk away from them. I looked toward Skylar in the front row. And when the moment came, the moment when stepping back would have been safer, I didn't leave the people who needed me. I didn't list technical specifications. I didn't recite contracts. I told them the story of a stranded jet, of a child's quiet certainty, of the choice to trust her. Not because she was the safest option, but because she was right. I spoke about the hangar, about the voices that had come forward, about the hidden patterns we had uncovered, about how, sometimes. His composure cracked when the weight of his own story collapsed under the truth of ours. The questions that followed weren't for him. They were for me. For Skylar. For the hangar. The tide shifted. Supporters flooded back. Messages poured into our inboxes. Engineers I had never met thanked us for opening doors they thought were forever sealed. Ben's last move had failed. Victory didn't come without its cost. When the cameras powered down, when the last applause faded into the static of distant headlines, the silence finally settled in, and with it, the weight of what I had lost. Ben's campaign may have crumbled, but the scars he left behind remained etched across my life. Key investors quietly withdrew. Old partners, once eager to stand at my side, slipped away, offering polite but distant explanations. They didn't want the shadow of controversy to linger over their portfolios. A story that could fade into history. I became, in their eyes, expendable. Sophia left soon after. She didn't leave in anger, nor with betrayal, just exhaustion. She had weathered too many storms beside me, and I couldn't ask her to carry the weight of another. "I need quiet," she told me gently. "And you're not done fighting yet." Her departure left a space that felt too wide to fill. The company I had built, the empire I'd fought to keep alive, it no longer resembled what I had envisioned. It was still running, still generating contracts, but its heart was somewhere else now. I didn't fight for the balance sheets anymore. I fought for the hangar, for the stories still coming in, for the people who had found courage in what we built. But with each day, I also realized how much I had stepped further away from the life I used to know. I deactivated old accounts, dissolved silent partnerships, and quietly withdrew from the networks I once dominated. The world I had clawed into no longer belonged to me. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of letting it go. I traded conference calls for late-night walks under street lamps that flickered just a little too dim. Skylar visited sometimes. Her grandmother insisted on balance. She would solve puzzles with me in the afternoon and ride her bike through the neighborhood in the evening. As she carefully arranged metal parts on the wooden table, when she asked, "Do you miss it? The company?" I asked. She shook her head. "The noise." I thought about it longer than I expected. "No," I said eventually. "I think I confused the noise with purpose." She smiled softly, like she already understood. I began to rebuild, not the empire, not the public image, but myself. Not from scratch, from what remained. I started writing. Not articles, not press statements. Just stories, quiet records of the people we met, the things we uncovered. I found rhythm in the mundane. I stopped chasing the next summit. I stopped measuring worth by what the world could see. And though the edges of that loss still cut sometimes, I learned to sit with them, to let them be part of the room without demanding to banish them. Some mornings, I would step into the workshop, the sun stretching lazily across the scattered tools, and find Skylar's newest sketches waiting for me. She didn't need me to guide her anymore. She had long since outgrown my instruction. But she still left those sketches, and I still showed up to see them, not because I needed to lead, but because I wanted to walk beside her. And in that quiet, in the simple cadence of rebuilding a life not bound by expectation, I found something I had never made room for before. I found enough. One autumn afternoon, long after the headlines had faded, I met someone who would unknowingly stitch the last frayed edges of me back together. It wasn't planned. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and old paper. The shelves overflowed with ceramics, handwritten notes, and small plants that seemed to thrive in the scattered light. But simply to stand beside me. "You like the kintsugi pieces," she observed, her voice as warm as the sun slipping through the dusty window. I didn't answer. Not fully. Instead, I whispered. "Often we didn't." She taught me to appreciate the weight of silence, not as absence, but as space. One rainy afternoon, as I traced my finger along the gold lines of another repaired cup, she asked. But I hadn't fully let go. Pieces of the past still clung to me like thorns: Ben's betrayal, the partners who turned away, the faces that doubted, the moments I had failed. And beneath all that, I still held a quiet resentment toward myself. For the mistakes, for the times I wasn't enough. That evening, I sat at home, alone at the worn kitchen table, and I wrote. I didn't write press releases or technical breakdowns. I wrote letters I would never send. One to Ben, one to Sophia, one to the version of myself who chased noise, who thought validation could drown out fear. I let the ink carry the weight I had trapped inside for far too long. I didn't dress the words in courtesy. I wrote the rawness. I let the bitterness rise, crest, then settle. And when I finished, I folded each letter, slid them into envelopes I would never seal. I tucked them into the fireplace, struck a single match, and watched the edges curl, the flames devour what I no longer needed to carry. The fire hissed, hungry but brief. When the last ember dimmed, I felt something in me soften, a space I hadn't touched in years. I wasn't absolved. I wasn't repaired like a machine, but I had made room for something else. Later that week, I returned to the shop. The woman poured tea again, her hand steady as always. I sat across from her, this time not as a shadow of my former self, but as someone slowly learning to fit inside his own skin. I thanked her, not with grand words, but with the quiet steadiness of presence. She simply smiled and handed me a small, imperfect pot, glazed in soft greens, its base uneven but solid. "This one's yours," she said. I traced its ridges, its asymmetry, and realized it was perfect in its incompleteness. That day, I bought a small plant and placed it in the pot, setting it by my kitchen window. I cared for it, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. And against all odds, it thrived. The roots tangled in the soil I had chosen, the leaves steady in their quiet reach toward the morning light. A life, imperfect but real, like mine, like hers, like all of us still piecing ourselves back together, not to erase the breaks, but to let the gold fill them. Life, once a relentless race, settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. Each morning unfolded with unremarkable simplicity. I brewed my own coffee now, no assistants, no meticulously scheduled meetings waiting to devour the hours ahead. Neighborhood streets became familiar underfoot, their uneven sidewalks and overgrown hedges offering a quiet kind of comfort. The world I'd built before had always been sharp, towering, demanding. This world, the one I moved through now, asked for nothing but presence. Sometimes I crossed paths with Skylar, riding her bike, her laughter trailing behind her like music caught in the wind. Sometimes she'd wave. Other times she'd simply nod, as if we both understood that words weren't always necessary. I didn't need to hold her hand anymore. She was already further ahead than most. I let them build. What I offered instead was space, a place where they could grow without the shadow of expectation tightening around them. I found other ways to contribute. At a community center downtown, I began helping a small group of teenagers, kids who had been told, over and over, that they wouldn't make it, not because they lacked talent. And something shifted. These young builders, these outliers, began to trust their own instincts, to chase ideas that didn't require permission. They taught me, too, how to stay curious, how to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, how to measure progress in inches, not miles. The foundation expanded quietly, no longer needing to carry the burden of my former reputation. New partnerships formed, not from old obligations, but from genuine alignment. Skylar returned occasionally, though her world had grown much larger than mine. She advised teams designing environmental drones, led sessions on systems thinking, and guided younger minds with a patience I could only marvel at. She wasn't a child clinging to genius anymore. She had become a compass, not just for me, but for everyone who had found their way to the hangar, to the foundation, to the movement that now moved freely without my hand on the wheel. You don't have to keep proving you deserve to be here. I laughed, a soft, genuine sound I hadn't heard from myself in years. Maybe I finally believed that. She smiled. But because they mattered. I spoke at small gatherings, local workshops, quiet rooms filled with people searching for a way to stand again after falling. I told them not about saving companies or winning contracts. I told them about Skylar, about trust, about staying when the world begged you to run. And I invited them to tell their own stories. Their experiences too fractured. I told them what I had learned. Sometimes the most powerful story isn't the one that shouts the loudest. I found myself standing in front of the place where it had all begun. The old airstrip. The runway was still there, cracked and weathered now, its edges softened by creeping grass. The hangar's paint had faded, the once bright signs dulled by years of sun and dust. I hadn't planned the visit. My steps simply carried me there, as if some part of me had unfinished business waiting among the silence. Walking across the familiar concrete, I traced the lines where the Gulf Stream had once stalled, where panic had wrapped itself around my throat. I could almost hear the echo of Skylar's small, steady voice, explaining systems I had barely trusted. I stood still, breathing in the dry, metallic scent of the desert air. The memories surfaced, not as sharp stabs, but as gentle ripples. I remembered the fear. I remembered the gamble. And I remembered the moment I chose to stay. Returning here, I didn't feel the weight I had braced for. The ghosts that had haunted this space no longer had teeth. They simply existed, quiet. It was where I had faced the ultimatum, where I had heard my own name, not as a leader, but as a liability. Inside, I found the table where Arthur Jenkins had once laid out his careful threats. I didn't come here to demand explanations. I came to understand that I no longer needed them. Leaving the tent, I walked along the edge of the runway where Brenda had first introduced Skylar to me. I remembered the way I had doubted her, the way I had clung to the logic that solutions could only come from those who fit the mold. It humbled me. The memory didn't sting, it softened. I made my way back to the small administrative building. Time had settled heavily there. Doors sagged, windows clouded. But in one room, tucked behind a cracked partition, I found a forgotten box. I whispered words I had never found the courage to say aloud before. Thank you, not just for the life you saved, but for the chance to carry something forward. Leaving the building, I found no urge to take the photo with me. It belonged here. I placed it back in the box, leaving it among the quiet debris. I walked the runway one last time, the desert wind brushing against me. Hands in his coat pockets, his frame a little more stooped, his presence no longer sharp but subdued. Our eyes met. There was no anger, no unfinished argument, just recognition. He approached, his step slow, his voice softer than I remembered. You stayed, he said simply. So did you, I replied. We didn't trade apologies. We didn't need them. He offered a quiet nod, one that didn't ask for forgiveness, but perhaps offered something like understanding. I returned the gesture, and with that, we parted. No grand speeches, no final declarations, just the subtle closing of a chapter neither of us had fully realized we were still holding. As I walked away, the air felt lighter. I hadn't come here to fix the past. I had come to let it rest. Not long after that quiet return to the airstrip, I did something I never thought I would. I told the story publicly, not through press releases, not by carefully managed interviews, but in my own words, raw, unpolished, honest. I sat alone in my workshop one evening, a single lamp casting soft light over the worn table, and recorded a video. No scripts, no handlers, just me, the camera, and the truth I had carried for years. I spoke about the day the jet failed, about the disbelief that a child could see what teams of experts missed. I told them about the choice I made, about the quiet network that grew from those first fragile connections, about the countless stories that emerged not to glorify, but to reveal what was hidden. I spoke not to reclaim reputation, but to offer something to those still sitting in silence, still wondering if their voices mattered. When I uploaded the video, I didn't expect it to travel far. I thought it might touch a few people, maybe spark a small conversation. But something about the way it landed, unpolished, imperfect, resonated. It spread. not because it was crafted to go viral, who had doubted their place in rooms that didn't welcome them. They told me about the projects they abandoned because no one believed in them. They shared moments they had stayed silent when their ideas were dismissed. They thanked me, not for being flawless, but for being willing to stand in the mess and keep going. It wasn't long before small speaking invitations arrived. Local gatherings, workshops, community centers, no bright lights, no grand stages. And that was exactly where I wanted to be. In those rooms, I listened more than I spoke. I heard stories of quiet resilience, of risks taken in shadows, of failures that taught more than success ever could. People didn't come looking for blueprints. They came for proof that starting over was still possible. In those spaces, something grew, not a company, not a movement with banners and slogans, but a shared understanding that sometimes standing back up isn't about winning. It's about refusing to disappear. The hangar became more than a digital archive, sharing designs, fixing things their schools had long forgotten. They built community drones to track local wildlife, repaired broken water systems in old buildings, and challenged each other to think beyond what they were told was possible. They didn't need permission. They didn't wait for someone to hand them authority. They built anyway. In every message, every shared story, I saw the same thread, the quiet rebellion against being overlooked. It wasn't about me anymore. It never really was. One evening, after another workshop, I ended my next video with a simple invitation. If this story found you, if you've been waiting to begin again, tell us. Write it down. Share the unfinished, the cracked, the nearly forgotten. Someone else might be waiting to hear they're not alone. I meant it. I wasn't building a brand. I was holding open a door. And maybe, just maybe, someone stepping through it would find their own way to keep walking. Not because I led them there, but because they realized they were already enough. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I would have chosen differently, knowing how much would unravel, how many pieces I'd be asked to leave behind. The answer always lands the same. I wouldn't change a step. Not recognition, but something far quieter. I found the steady pulse of meaning. I found the moment I stopped running from the version of myself I used to despise. The choices that nearly broke me are the same ones that shaped what I carry now. I am not free from regret, but I am free from wishing I had taken a safer path. Even the losses taught me how to stay when everything in me wanted to retreat. The broken partnerships, the vanished friends, the crumbling reputation, they were never the center of the story. They were markers along the way, reminders of where I stopped listening and where I began to see. I used to believe that achievement would silence the ache, not in some abstract, polished way, but in the marrow-deep recognition that hardship carved out space I hadn't known I needed. It stripped away the veneer, forced me to sit with the questions I kept trying to outrun. It made me linger in places I would have rushed past. The doubt taught me how to stay curious. The failure taught me how to pay attention. Even the betrayal taught me how to choose differently. When I think about those sleepless nights, when I played the moments over and over, I realized they were invitations I didn't yet know how to accept. Invitations to slow down, to look closer, to ask who I was becoming. For a long time, I hated the version of myself that cracked under pressure. Now, I see him as necessary. He wasn't the end of me. He was the beginning. Skylar once told me, years after the dust had settled, the gold in the fractures wasn't there to erase the breaks. It was there to honor them. I carry that now. I carry the quiet gratitude for the moments I wanted to disappear but chose to stay. I carry the steady rhythm of walking without racing. And I carry one truth I once fought to avoid. The only person I ever needed to stop fighting was myself. I thought I was chasing redemption. I thought I was building something that would finally prove my worth. But standing here, I see it clearly. I never needed to win against the world. I only needed to stop losing to the version of me who believed he didn't belong. And now, I don't carry that battle anymore. I don't walk with armor. I don't build to impress. I build to contribute. I stay because presence is enough. I speak because someone else might still be searching for their own voice in the quiet. I finish because the unfinished parts no longer frighten me. I have nothing to prove now, only something to offer. And that is more than I ever thought I would find. One evening, long after the workshops had ended and the streets had emptied, I sat alone at my worn desk, a blank page waiting in front of me. The quiet wasn't heavy, it was steady, a familiar companion now. I picked up the pen and began to write, but not for anyone else. This letter was for the version of me who had stood terrified on that desert runway. For the man who once believed walking away was the safest option. I wrote to the Marcus who thought his worth was tethered to flawless execution, who measured value in the deals he secured and the towers he built. You survived, even when you thought you wouldn't. Even when the world told you to step aside, to stop, to give up, you stayed. I remember how you crumbled under the weight of their disappointment, how their silence became a verdict you believed you couldn't escape. I remember the long nights, the tight chest, the questions you replayed like a cruel song stuck in your head. You didn't think you belonged, did you? You thought you were temporary, passing through borrowed spaces, clinging to borrowed time. But you were wrong. You mattered, then and now, not because you never failed, but because you chose to rise when no one else was watching. I paused, my breath catching on the edge of memory. I kept writing. I know you hated the cracks. I know you tried to plaster over them, to pretend they weren't there. I know you thought the only way to outrun your fear was to build faster, louder, taller. But here's what you didn't understand. Those cracks let the light find you. Those fractures became the places where others connected to you, not the polished edges, but the uneven seams. I forgive you for running. I forgive you for doubting. I forgive you for holding your breath in rooms where you thought you had to be perfect to stay. You never needed to earn your right to be here. I leaned back, the weight of the words settling across the room like soft dust. I thought about the version of me who had sat in boardrooms, gripping the edges of chairs, hoping no one would notice how tightly I held on. I thought about the early days, the long drives to places that didn't feel like home, the desperate grasp for certainty in a world I could never quite control. The young man I had been deserved to hear those words. I folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box, knowing I didn't need to send it anywhere. It had already reached the person who needed it most. Later that night, I walked outside, the air crisp, the streets silvered with moonlight. My steps weren't urgent. They no longer needed to be. I passed the corner cafe, now closed, the quiet hum of the city settling into its midnight rhythm. And for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't trying to escape him anymore, the man I had once been. I was walking with him. I thought about the parts of me I used to resent, the hesitation, the fear of being seen, the deep need to prove I wasn't a mistake. I used to shove those parts into dark corners, hoping they would disappear. But now, I see them differently. They weren't failures of character. But his caution had also kept me alive. I no longer wished him away. I welcomed him. I carried him forward, not as a shadow, but as a companion who had simply needed time to grow. I didn't catalog the flaws. I saw someone complete, not because he was finished, but because he had learned to stand in his own unfinishedness. And I smiled, not out of triumph, not out of relief, but because the reflection no longer frightened me. The boy who once begged to belong, the man who had stumbled, risen, fallen again, and continued, finally looked back at me with calm eyes. There was no longer a gap between who I had been and who I had become. There was only me, and I was enough. On a quiet morning, I sat at the same desk, another letter waiting to be written. This one wasn't for me. It was for Ben. His name lingered at the top of the page, sharp and familiar. Though the bitterness no longer burned the way it once did, I didn't write to reopen the battle. I wrote because there were things I had carried too long, things I was finally ready to put down. You probably never expected to hear from me. There were days I wished I'd never hear your name again. I replayed what you did, the sabotage, the betrayal, the way you tried to turn my story into rubble. I thought I wanted you to suffer for that. I thought I needed you to, but I don't. Not anymore. I paused, the ink settling into the grain of the paper, the weight of those early sentences pressing into the air around me. I spent years believing that your choices defined me, that what you did would always shape how the world saw me, that I would always be tethered to the damage you tried to leave behind. But the truth is, you never held me there. I did. I fed the story. I let it fester. I clung to the ache because it made me feel like I was still fighting. But I'm tired of carrying it. I no longer need to win against you. I don't need you to apologize. I don't need you to understand. I simply need to let go. My grip loosened on the pen as I continued, steady and sure. You taught me something I didn't expect. You showed me where I still looked for external validation. You forced me to see the cracks I was desperate to hide, without intending to. But it releases me from trying to carry the weight of hating you. I folded the letter, not to send, but to seal the decision in my own heart. Later, I walked to the small park where the air was laced with the scent of pine and damp earth. I stood by a wooden bench, the letter trembling slightly in my hand, not from anger. I didn't expect a grand transformation, but there was a distinct lightness, a quiet vacancy where resentment had once pressed against my ribs. The years I had spent entangled in that wound no longer felt like a cage. I had freed myself. I left the park without looking back, the path ahead clear, no echoes pulling me to retrace old steps. There was no celebration waiting, no audience, just the subtle hum of freedom. In the days that followed, I noticed how space returned in small ways, how my breath moved easier, how my thoughts didn't circle old arguments, how the sharp edges dulled without me forcing them to. I found myself caring less about who remembered the details, who recounted the battles correctly. The story didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be mine. I reached out to Sophia, not to revisit the past, but to simply ask how she was. Her voice carried no remnants of old tension. She sounded lighter too, her life unfolding on a different page, and we shared brief, uncomplicated words. No unfinished business lingered between us. I wrote often now, letters I would never send. Letters that didn't need destinations. Some I burned. Some I folded into the seams of books I would leave behind. All of them became small, deliberate steps away from the anchors I had long mistaken for identity. Each flame, each quiet release, softened the weight I no longer needed to bear. I thought about the people who had drifted away, those whose absence had once gnawed at me. I didn't chase them anymore. Their leaving had created the space I now cherished. I didn't need them to return. I didn't need to explain who I had become. I sat in the workshop one evening, tracing the uneven surface of a ceramic cup. It simply waited for me to keep walking. And I did. There came a day when I simply sat, doing nothing. No letters, no calculations, no tasks demanding urgency. I sat by the window. I didn't feel the need to interrupt the stillness. I didn't fill the space with noise. I let it hold me. For the first time, I didn't brace for the next failure, the next judgment. As if I had finally stepped into the rhythm life had been offering all along. I didn't narrate the moment to myself. I didn't name it as healing or progress. I just lived in it. Minutes passed. The light shifted. The steam rising from the cup dissolved into the air, leaving only the warmth lingering against my palms. I didn't reach for a device. I didn't replay old conversations. I simply listened to the wind brushing through the trees, to the faint rustle of papers left on the table, to the small, patient sounds that had always been there, waiting for me to notice. If you're sitting in the quiet, I said, if you're still holding the weight of stories you're afraid to tell, I'm here. I paused, letting the stillness breathe between the words, as steady as the breeze weaving past the window frame. Sometimes, I continued, you don't need someone to fix it. Sometimes you just need someone to stay long enough for the silence to stop feeling so sharp. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the gravity of those words settle in. The comments that arrived days later weren't long. They weren't public declarations or polished replies. They were simple acknowledgments. I needed to hear this. I've been waiting in the quiet for a long time. Thank you for not rushing. And that was enough. I wasn't speaking to crowds. I was speaking to individuals who had tucked their stories deep inside, unsure if anyone would notice. Each message I sent out wasn't a broadcast. It was an invitation, a space to rest, a reminder that being unfinished isn't a problem to solve. It's a place to live. I continued, recording in dim light, my voice calm, steady, sometimes pausing for minutes to let the silence stretch without apology. If you're holding something you've been afraid to share, you can tell me. I meant it. I read each reply as if it was the only one. I responded not as a leader, not as a former figure in headlines, but as a person who had learned to sit with his own quiet and found it not so unbearable. Your story matters, I whispered into the lens, even if you're still in the middle of it, even if you don't know where it's going yet. I kept the comments open, not for performance, for connection. The videos didn't carry music. They didn't follow trending algorithms. They moved slowly, like streams carving steady paths through stone. I didn't ask them to grow. I only asked them to be places where someone could rest. And they became that. Spaces where stories waited, where silence was allowed to speak. I closed each recording the same way, not with conclusions, but with quiet. And somewhere out there, on late nights or quiet mornings, someone always answered. Before closing that chapter, I wanted to offer something simple, a moment of acknowledgement. Thank you, I said softly in one final video. Thank you for staying with me, through the pauses, through the unfinished parts, through the quiet. I let those words linger, Not rushed, not packaged. I meant every syllable. To those who had listened, to those who had trusted me with their own fragments, to those who had found their way into the spaces we built together, I was grateful. I placed my hand gently over my chest, not as a symbol, but because I felt the weight of it there. I didn't need a crowd. I didn't need applause. I needed to say it out loud. People to sit beside. But I didn't need to control what came next. Life had taught me that the most honest paths rarely follow the maps we draw. What mattered was remaining open, remaining present, remaining willing to stay, even when the next step wasn't clear. And that was the promise I offered, not to always have answers, but to keep showing up. I leaned back slightly, allowing a quiet breath to fill the space between sentences. If you've ever picked yourself up from the lowest place, if you've ever chosen to keep walking when it would have been easier to sit down and disappear, don't keep that story to yourself. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. I didn't ask them to tell it perfectly. I asked them to tell it honestly, to share the pieces they'd almost left behind, to trust that even the jagged parts had value. Because sometimes, the story you think no one needs is the story someone else is waiting to hear. I finished the recording. Just the last frame of me sitting quietly, the window open, the breeze shifting the edges of a folded letter resting nearby. A closing that didn't close anything. A space left open. Because some stories never really end, they just change shape. And maybe that was the truest kind of completion. One that allows others to step in, to add their own chapters, their own voices, their own steady breaths. In the weeks that followed, people continued to send messages. Some were long. Some were a single sentence. I'm learning to stay. I shared my story today. Even though my hands shook. Thank you for not leaving when it got hard. I read each one, carefully, slowly, holding them like the fragile, beautiful things they were. Sometimes I wrote back. Sometimes I simply sat with their words, letting them settle in the same quiet that had become my home. And that was enough. The stories belonged to them now. The space belonged to all of us. And as I stepped away from the recording, away from the pages I'd filled, away from the version of me who once believed he had to earn his place, I smiled. Not because everything was resolved, not because every answer had arrived, but because I no longer needed them all. I had found something steadier, a life not built on proving, but on presence, on listening, on showing up when the quiet asked me to stay.